Our scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verses 29 to 36. This introduces, or is near the beginning of the story of Joseph, son of Jacob, his 11 brothers. And the scripture reads, "When Reuben, the eldest brother, returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and he said, 'The boy is gone, and where can I turn?' And they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, 'This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not.' He recognized it, and he said, 'It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces.' When Jacob tore his garments and put on sackcloth on his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, 'No, I shall go down to my grave mourning my son.' Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard." May God add his blessing to the reading of this word. It seems to me that there are two kinds of disasters that we face in life. And one is the slow-moving disaster, the one that we see coming miles away, months away, perhaps years away. We anticipate it's coming. We may even prepare for it, get ready in practical ways, get ready in emotional ways. But even then, when it comes, it can be difficult. Hard to face, difficult to overcome. That is one way disasters come upon us. But the other way is out of the blue. In a quick flash, and suddenly we go from what we had to now what we have, and everything has changed, and disaster is here upon us. Well, I think that seems to be the way the disaster fell upon Jacob, upon his family, upon his son Joseph, and the brothers there. We imagine Jacob, old Jacob, sitting there. His big family all around him. Jacob had 12 sons. His favorite son by far was Joseph. And there he was sitting that day, waiting for his family to come in, waiting for the boys to come in from the field. And he must have known something was wrong when he saw them come in. He looked at their faces. He looked at the way they were carrying themselves. And he said to them, Where is my son? Where is Joseph? Well, the brothers had taken Joseph's robe, they had torn it up, they had covered it with blood, and they had made their father believe that he was dead. Jacob was there, believing his favorite son was dead, and that is how quickly disaster came upon him. Came upon his family. Even though we know that Joseph was still alive, Jacob would believe it for years to come. His son had been killed by a wild animal in the wilderness. How did this family deal with disaster? How do we deal with disaster today? Well, first, let's say and admit that there are some of us, and perhaps all of us at times, are this way, that we feed upon disaster. We don't mind a little disaster. In fact, we're out there looking for it. We have sort of a negative frame, a negative point of view, a negative way of looking at the world. And so we're always on the lookout for somebody who is insulting us. Something to go badly, something to go wrong. And so everything is colored by that. We want a little disaster in our lives, and so we'll take the simplest thing and we'll turn it into a disaster. We say things like, "Oh, that vacation was a disaster because there was some traffic, because the hotel room wasn't ready, because the hamburger we ate was a little overcooked," and we make that into a disaster. Well, that's not what we're talking about today. We may do that from time to time, and there may be folks in this world that like to see the whole world that way, and are always on the lookout for disaster. But what we are talking about today are the real disasters that come into our lives. How do we define them? What are they? Well, quite literally, the word disaster means against the stars. It relates back to astrology, the belief that the stars control our lives. And so against the stars, something that happens in our lives against the stars, against faith. But we were more specifically, thinking about disasters in our lives, what does that mean? Well, they are the things that bring great change into our lives. Those things, those negative events, distressful events that come into our lives and bring change for us. Change for our families. We have our nice pattern that we have settled into. We know who is in our lives. We know who is important. And then suddenly, that changes. Everything is a bit different. Everything is radically different. And we and our families must adjust to that. The one thing we know about disaster, and the one thing we can say, is this truly a disaster or not, is are we changed by it? Anyone who has been through a real disaster in their lives know that when disaster comes, we are different from it. We are changed because of it, and we respond in different ways to it. We all have different ways of responding. We have choices that we can make when disaster comes our way, and we see that surely in the story of Jacob and Joseph and the 11 brothers. Disaster, how do they deal with it? How do they respond to it? Well, one tempting way to respond, and perhaps it's inevitable, perhaps this is just human nature, but it is so easy to begin responding to disaster by looking for someone to blame. Who is to blame for this? Here in our story today, we read about Reuben, the oldest brother. And he knows he is partly to blame. The eldest brother, he should have been looking out for everybody. He should have been making sure nothing bad happened. He knew that he was partly to blame, and he felt that in his heart. And surely though Joseph himself was partly to blame, running around. The scriptures make it clear. He was full of himself. He was arrogant. He was flaunting, how much he was loved by his father to his brothers. Surely he was partly to blame too. And his father Jacob, for spoiling him in the first place, was partly to blame. And of course the brothers who actually did this were to blame as well. And so we can spend our time, and how tempting it is to portion out blame between everyone involved, to decide in our minds who is the most to blame and who is least. And of course, when disaster comes into our lives, no matter how far away we are from it, no matter how much it was out of our control, we will end up trying to figure out how are we to blame. What could I have done differently? And what a waste of time, ultimately, that is. Certainly, that is a part of our nature, and there are times when we do need to figure out blame. That is certainly true. But ultimately, when it comes to disaster coming into our lives and changing us, and us having to adapt to it, having to adjust to it, the question of why, who to blame, isn't the most important question. The real question is, how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to adapt to it? That's a very hard question. Adapting, changing, isn't it easier to concentrate on who's to blame? So much easier. And so we fall into that temptation, and all we do is think, who is to blame? And again, we so often come back to ourselves. What could I have done differently? If I had just done this, if I had just done that, would that have averted that disaster? And we get so wrapped up into that, so wrapped up into it, it keeps us from getting to that second question. How are we supposed to respond to this? How are we going to adapt to it? That's the first risk. That's something we need to be on the lookout for. How do we respond to disaster? Well, often we respond by wanting to assign blame. But that's not the only way we can respond. Again, from the story, we see several ways of responding. And one is certainly simply to give up. That's another tempting alternative. To give up. So much easier than actually having to adjust, having to adapt, having to change because of this disaster that has come our way. We see it in Joseph's father, Jacob. And Jacob learned of this disaster that came into his life and began mourning. And the scriptures say that all his sons and daughters came to him to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He refused to be comforted. No, I shall go to my grave mourning. And thus his father wept for him. We never hear any more about Jacob in this story, except toward the very end, when Jacob and Joseph are reunited. But as far as we know, as far as the scripture makes clear to us, is Jacob lived up to his words here and spent the rest of his life until he would be reunited with his son, many, many years later, in mourning, giving up. And that's certainly an option for us. And again, how much easier that can be, or it seems to be. I think it's a lie, actually. We think that's easier. We think that's going to help us, but it's not easier. We have to proceed with adapting. We have to proceed with moving through the disaster that we find ourselves in. But here we see that this was simply, for Jacob, one disaster too many. He gave up and he gave in, and certainly that is an option for us as we face disaster. But if we want to see the person who I think the scripture is pointing us to in this situation, it isn't Jacob, it isn't Reuben, it isn't the guilt that the father felt, or that the brothers felt, or the grieving that the father felt. It is Joseph. It is how he showed the second alternative. How is he going to get through? That is what he concentrated on, adapting to this new situation that he found himself in. You know, he started out as a spoiled and arrogant boy. And he ended up in the story by the end as the man that God intended him to be. That's a great picture in any stories, when someone can become the person that God intends them to be. And that's what happened for Jacob. That's what happened for Joseph. He became the person that God intended him to be. The scriptures say that it is, or the Psalms tell us that it is in Egypt, after he was sold into slavery, it is then that the iron entered his soul. The iron entered his soul. Now, for Jacob, back at home, that disaster had been a quick one. It had been fast, and then it was up to him to deal with it. But for Joseph in Egypt, it is a slow-moving disaster. It is years after year of captivity, imprisonment, and slavery that passed in front of him. And that is how many disasters do come our way. Sometimes they do come suddenly, and other times they come slowly. And it is disappointment day after day, year after year, and then we find ourselves in sort of a slow-moving disaster where every day is difficult for us. It's little disappointments build up one after another. We can find ourselves in a situation that to us feels like a disaster. Certainly that seems to be what Joseph experienced. And yet what he did was to treat that disaster, to treat those disappointments like a ladder. And he kept moving on. He kept adapting. He kept changing. He kept trying to grow into the person that God created him to be. He gave a lot of energy to that. He did not sit still. He did not give up. In fact, when he was a slave, he gave so much energy to it, he became in charge of the household, in charge of all the slaves. Then when he was falsely accused, he was put into prison. He became the head prisoner, in charge of everything, they say, that went on in the prison. How then did he deal with disaster? Well, he faced it. An unwelcome and unwanted crisis, and he began the process of climbing through. And, we read this story, and it all seems to happen so quickly. We read it, it's here just in a few verses. But for him, it was years and years and years of persistently working, persistently moving, that caused him to be able to move through this and to grow a little bit, day by day, week by week. He faced this crisis, and he climbed through it. He faced this disaster, and he became who God wanted him to be. Well, I like the story that I heard some years ago about a fellow who was, it's a true story, a fellow who was flying in a small plane. He was the passenger. And just like you see in the movies or on a TV show, perhaps, as he's flying, they're sitting next to the pilot. The pilot has a heart attack and is completely disabled. You cannot get him to wake at all. And this man does not know how to fly an airplane at all. Well, fortunately, the pilot kind of showed him the basics of flying as they'd gone up together. Right at the beginning there of the flight, it showed him how to control the plane, just the basics. And with those basics, and with a lot of help from the ground, this fellow who had never flown a plane before was able to safely land. And I like what a columnist who wrote about this said. Here's what the columnist said about this incident. He said, it got me thinking how much the same thing happens to you and me through our lives. We get a little flying lesson at something or other, and suddenly we're in charge. And we're expected to keep from burning and crashing. Nearly every major undertaking is like this. It certainly was for me in college. My folks slowed down at a dorm. They dropped me off, and they said something like, go get them, Tiger, and then they were off. Then a few years later, they dropped me off at church. They put me at the altar, and they said something like, go get them, Tiger, and sat down to watch me get married. The writer then concludes in this way. This man, back on the ground, put it pretty well for all of us. He said this, the fellow who landed. I guess I'm a little bit lucky. Surely I was scared, but it was a funny kind of scared. Oh, not really panic. And the writer concludes by saying, does this sound familiar? Of course it does. But this is the way it happens to us all through life. No wonder we're a funny kind of scared so much. And that's the way it was with Joseph. Without a lesson, without knowing what to do next, he was able to respond to disaster. To overcome it, to move through it. And praise be to God for him and for so many, in some way, to be able to be stronger because of it. Not by establishing blame. Not by giving in to defeat. But by rising to the challenge that the disaster brings. Is it easy? No. It is not easy. It is never easy. It is a battle. It is a grind, day by day, but with God in our lives, with Christ in our hearts. There is no obstacle, no disaster that we cannot overcome. Let us bow and pray. Loving God, thank you for your many gifts to us. And Lord, today we focus on the gift of your presence. The strength that you can bring into our lives in the moments when we need it the most. Loving God, help us to prepare our hearts, our minds for those times that come in all of our lives. And Lord, every day, help us to feel your presence presence and